Good afternoon. On behalf of St. John's Abbey University and Preparatory School, I would like to welcome you to this celebration of the remarkable life of Eugene J. McCarthy, a courageous individual, a true statesman, and a man whose legacy reverberates far beyond St. John's and the state of Minnesota. I would like to extend a special welcome to the members of Senator McCarthy's family who have joined us today. And a welcome as well to his close friends and honored colleagues from his many years of public service. Before this memorial mass begins, we will hear from two of our eulogists, Father Hilary Timish and Mr. Al Isley. After their remarks, we will stand for the processional hymn, and our liturgy will formally begin. After communion, we will hear from two others, Gene's son, Michael McCarthy, and Vice President Walter Mondale. Our first speaker, President Emeritus of St. John's University, Father Hilary Timish, has been a monk of St. John's Abbey since 1948. He teaches English, is a beloved faculty resident, and served as president of St. John's University from 1982 to 1991. Over the years, Father Hilary has spent time with Senator McCarthy on a number of occasions. He was one of the speakers at the Senator's 80th birthday reception at Washington's Willard Hotel and saw him regularly in recent years. Al Isley, a 1958 graduate of St. John's University, is a journalist and the founder and recently retired editor of The Hill, a nonpartisan, non-ideological weekly newspaper covering Congress and its members. As a journalist, Al followed Eugene McCarthy's political career from its earliest days in Washington to his retirement from political life and beyond. In 1972, he published Almost to the Presidency, a political biography of Senator McCarthy. Over the years, Al grew to become a close, steadfast, and generous friend of the late Senator. Please join me in welcoming Father Hilary Timish and Mr. Al Isley.
I want to say something about Gene's connection with St. John's. Eugene McCarthy's ties to St. John's were long and deep. He was a member of the St. John's family for almost 70 years, as a student in the prep school and the college, as a member of the faculty, as a Benedictine novice, and as a distinguished alumnus. I think it's accurate to say that he never lost his affection for St. John's and his regard for the people he knew here, fellow students, monks, faculty. He once suggested that the coming together of faculty, students, and school in central Minnesota may have been a historical accident. Accident or not, he was a college student at St. John's at just the moment when a very gifted student could take his intellectual bearings from a dean who had gained national prominence in Catholic circles for leadership in liturgical renewal and social thought, and from a cluster of young Benedictine faculty, Godfrey Diekman among them, who brought to life in a contemporary idiom the ancient monastic synthesis of learning and spirituality. Looking back on his student years at St. John's in 1987, Gene traced the emergence of St. John's as a distinctive institution to the work of the dean of the college, Father Virgil Michael, who, in Gene's words, highlighted the role of the Benedictine monastery and school in religion, education, and social reform. Unfortunately, Virgil Michael died much too young in 1938. But Gene was so taken with his experience at St. John's and his Benedictine mentors that 5 years after he graduated from college, he came back to St. John's to teach briefly and then to enter the monastic novitiate, to test a calling to be a monk himself. Modern commentators don't know what to make of that, so they usually skip it. He remained in the novitiate for almost a year, listening to the rule of Benedict, praying, trying to determine where and how he was called to seek God. There were other voices speaking to him as well. As Father John Koulas, a long-time member of the faculty, puts it, voices leading him to other ways of seeking and finding and serving God. In the end, he decided to direct his search for God toward marriage, family, teaching, dedicated public service, without rejecting the high ideals instilled in the novitiate, the quest for God, for peace, for justice. I don't think I'd be going out on a limb to say that the monastic influence in his early life continued throughout his life, and maybe had some bearing on his apparent detachment from the office he sought in 1968. His calm choice of the word willing to describe his attitude toward being president. Commentators have seen this as a paradox. A campaigner cool about the object of his campaign. Martin Peretz, writing in last week's New Republic, suggests that this attitude stemmed from a classic political ideal. Peretz writes, "The diffidence of the politician annoyed the political professionals, but it was intrinsic to his message. One should not seek the presidency in a frenzy," he seemed to be saying. When he would say that he was willing to be president, one heard echoes of the founding fathers' own ideals of tempered ambition and their insistence upon the debt of politics to philosophical ideas. Gene was a Democrat who disciplined himself to Republican virtue. So far, Peretz. Without questioning Gene's political philosophy, Father Don Talifas reports a conversation with him during the '68 campaign that suggests another perspective. This is Don talking now. He says, "I was doing graduate study in Berkeley when Senator McCarthy made a stop in San Francisco, staying at the Fairmont Hotel. We sat and talked in his suite, and not about politics or the campaign. He was more interested in discussing the recently published English translation of what was popularly known as the Dutch Catechism, a byproduct, you might say, of the Second Vatican Council. That a politician engaged in a momentous political campaign was able to step back from it, be detached from it enough to discuss the shift in Catholic theology embodied in the Dutch Catechism, surely indicates an ability to see the nitty-gritty of his immediate preoccupation as ultimately subordinate to larger, more long-range concerns. It can be seen as reflecting the God-centered or Christ-centered thought which permeates the rule of St. Benedict. So far done. As regards St. John's, Eugene was not inclined to be sentimental about the Twin Towers or the Pine Curtain. But he relished the memory of men he had known as teachers and confreres. He remembered them as individuals, appreciated their idiosyncrasies, and their conviction that a liberal arts education was all the better for including a healthy involvement in sports. In fact, he once remarked to Father Tim O'Backus, athletic director, that being in St. John's athletics as a player and a coach had taught him that the essence of competition was not bullying, but problem solving, a lesson that later proved useful in politics. He was especially taken by Father Dunstan Tucker's commitment to both Dante, which Dunstan taught, and baseball, which Dunstan coached. Eugene said, "He had no doubts about my ability to play first base, but occasionally he showed less than full faith in my hitting ability." When Eugene went to the Senate years later, he chose a St. John's professor of social thought, Emerson Hines, incidentally, originally attracted to St. John's by Virgil Michael, as his legislative director, and a local alumnus, Jerry Eller, as his administrative assistant. During the campaign in the summer of 1968, one of Eugene's novitiate classmates, Father Coleman Berry, by then president of St. John's University, invited him to spend a few days on campus. He brought his staff with him, and he read poetry, walked in the woods, and got up a softball game for his whole entourage, including the Secret Service. In his later years, he was on campus many times. He was here occasionally to receive awards, most recently the Armor of Light Award given by the prep school alumni. He came to speak or to take part in panels or simply to visit old friends like Father Godfrey. I saw him quite frequently during my tenure as president in the 80s, and I have warm memories of visits to him in Washington and Virginia. But the memory that stays with me is of an after-dinner conversation one night in the president's office, where a small group of us put aside the issues of the day and listened to Eugene recite some poems of Yeats. One of them was in memory of Major Robert Gregory. Gregory was the son of Lady Gregory, a friend of Yeats, who had been killed in the First World War. The poem begins, "Now that we're almost settled in our house, I'll name the friends that cannot sup with us." And the poem proceeds to describe cherished friends who have passed away, Major Gregory the most recent. I can still hear Eugene reciting the closing line in that quiet room with his customary reserve. "A thought of that late death took all my heart for speech." A thought of that late death took all my heart for speech. That's as good a note as any for me to end on. Thank you.
Senator McCarthy often said that the biggest problem with his '68 campaign was the sound system, so I'm going to make sure that this one works, and I'll speak loud. I want to thank the McCarthy family, Abbot John, Brother Dietrich, for this opportunity to join in paying tribute to a great American whose life and legacy we are celebrating today. Eugene McCarthy changed the course of history. He helped restore a sense of honesty, integrity, and decency to American government and politics, which is a legacy all Minnesotans can be proud of, especially those who are members of the St. John's worldwide community. I hope my words will honor not only his Senator McCarthy, but the members of his family who are here, his children Ellen, Margaret, and Michael, and his grandchildren, and especially his brother Austin, who followed him to St. John's but not into politics. We are gathered in this magnificent church, which is the heart and soul of the St. John's community. Although it and the monastic wing behind us were just a big hole in the ground when I left here in 1958, I have often worshipped here, as did Senator McCarthy. But I have to tell you that standing at this lectern is much different and more daunting experience than sitting where you are. I want to acknowledge the presence of former Vice President Walter Mondale, who served with Senator McCarthy in the Senate, and for whom I had the honor of working when he was Vice President of the United States. He and Senator McCarthy are among the many great public servants that this state has given to the nation. Senator McCarthy and I both graduated from St. John's, he in 1935 and I in 1958. I won't presume to make any other comparisons because he was one of the most brilliant students ever to go through St. John's, and I was not. He graduated magna cum laude, and I graduated magna cum baseball. We do share one thing in common, which is the Benedictine values, both spiritual and temporal, that we were exposed to, and the sense of community we experienced here have left an indelible mark on us, as it did for most people who spent any time here. As I've often said, you can leave St. John's, but it doesn't leave you. Father Hillary has spoken eloquently of Senator McCarthy's ties to St. John's, but I want to talk about his life in public service. Senator McCarthy spent nearly 6 decades in Washington, including 10 years in the House of Representatives and 12 years in the Senate, and then almost 35 years as a very public private citizen. I was privileged to know him both as a journalist and friend for more than 40 of those years. I saw him often after he left office, and I visited him 1 week before he died. I covered him during the most important part of his public career, including his history-making 1968 campaign. I later wrote a dual biography of him and the late Hubert Humphrey, another great Minnesota Democrat, which I am in the process of updating and hope to have published in the next year, and I will be most grateful if everybody here buys a copy. Senator McCarthy did not hand out compliments indiscriminately, so I was pleased when I heard that what he said about my book. He said he disliked it less than the other books that had been written about him. From him, that was a high compliment. Incidentally, there are those who still blame him for the fact that Hubert Humphrey lost the 1968 election to Richard Nixon. I do not happen to share that belief. Humphrey lost because the Vietnam War left the Democratic Party deeply divided and the American people uncertain about the course of that war. But despite their differences, they remained friends to the end of Humphrey's life. In one of their last meetings shortly before Humphrey died in 1978, Senator McCarthy recalled that Humphrey said he wished that they could appear together at one more political event in Minnesota. He said to me, "Gene, you could give the philosophy and some jokes, and I could give the issues and a pep talk. The guest speaker would not even want to come on, and everybody would be happy." It is almost impossible in the brief time I have to do justice to Senator McCarthy's distinguished career and his many accomplishments. Like most politicians, indeed most people, he was a complex person. But he was more than that. To use a Latin term, he was sui generis, literally one of his own kind. Some people say he was difficult to know but easy to admire. I didn't find him either difficult to know or difficult to admire, certainly not difficult to admire even with my supposed journalistic objectivity. That probably had something to do with the fact of our common roots in rural Minnesota and at St. John's. I understood what he meant when he compared reaching consensus in the House and Senate with that difference between herding hogs and cattle. With members of the House, he said it was like herding pigs. You had to panic them at the beginning and then calm them down when you got them to where you want them to go. In the Senate, he said it was like herding cattle, just the other way around. Of course, I understood him when he said the motto of the Benedictine order is "Keep death daily before your eyes," which is a very good motto for politicians. Father Coleman Barry, who was president of St. John's when I was here, and who wrote the Centennial History of St. John's in 1956, gave me one of the best quotes for my book. Incidentally, Father Hillary did not tell you that he is the editor of the Sesquicentennial History of St. John's, which will be published next month. Anyway, Father Coleman, who was in the novitiate in the monastery with Senator McCarthy, who was then known as Frater Conan, said that when McCarthy announced he was leaving the monastery, it was like losing a 20-game winner. I feel confident in predicting that Senator McCarthy will be remembered as a 20-game winner in the great game of politics and life. Let me cite several qualities that I observed to justify that prediction. First, there was his intellectual honesty and integrity. I know of few politicians, especially in today's partisan atmosphere, who were as unwilling to compromise on matters of principle. It was no accident that Thomas More, Adlai Stevenson, and Senator Phil Hart were among his heroes. Second was his belief that government should serve the people, not the other way around. He exhibited that quality early on when he led a group of young House Democrats who pushed for civil rights and social justice and greater oversight of the intelligence community, as he did throughout his years in the Senate. Third was his conviction that the actions of government must, above all, be based on high moral standards. In November 1967, when he was still deciding whether to challenge Lyndon Johnson, he gave a speech at Macalester College in which he expressed this. He said, incidentally, I would point out here, I recently spent two weeks in Iraq, and it does not take much imagination to apply his words about the war in Vietnam to the war in Iraq. He said, we must raise the essential moral question as to whether there is a proper balance in what we may gain in what is projected as victory, in contrast with the loss of life, the loss of material goods, the loss of moral integrity and moral energy which goes with the effort. The answer, I think, is that it is not. Fourth were his brilliant intellect and formidable political skills. Senator McCarthy is often described as a kind of detached poet-philosopher who dabbled in politics. He was indeed a fine poet who campaigned with Robert Lowell and could quote Yeats at length, and who was familiar with Plato and Aristotle, and a Catholic intellectual who knew his Thomas Aquinas and the papal encyclicals on social justice. But he was also a superb politician who wrote his own speeches and knew how to count votes, and who campaigned as effectively in the bars of South St. Paul and South Boston as he did in the salons of Hollywood and Park Avenue. And make no mistake, there was a toughness beneath his cool, cerebral exterior. I have a copy of a letter that New York Times columnist Russell Baker wrote in 1989 to Adrian Winkle, who once taught here and was McCarthy's first administrative assistant in the House. He had written to him about a column Baker had written about McCarthy. He said, I like and admire Gene McCarthy, and then added what he called an interesting footnote. Recalling a conversation he had with then Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson shortly after McCarthy was elected to the Senate, he said, LBJ told me in 1958 when there was a quarrel whether to give the better committee assignment to McCarthy or Bill Proxmire, I said, how could I give it to Proxmire? McCarthy is tough. He'd cut my heart out. Then Baker added in an obvious reference to 1968, he finally did, sort of, I suppose. A fifth quality that I think has been overlooked and perhaps lost sight of in much of what has been said and written about Senator McCarthy in the later years of his life was his warm and human side. I want to share something that speaks to that quality. It's an email, part of an email I received from Kitty Kelly, the best-selling biographer who once worked as a very junior aide to Senator McCarthy. I saw her at his memorial service in Washington on Saturday and told her I was coming here to speak, and she said, be sure and tell all the warm and wonderful stories you know about the man, and then she told me one of her own. She said, I remember when I caught unshirted hell from Washington's media mandarins for describing myself on my resume as McCarthy's press assistant. The senator came to my defense, sort of. In my office, he said people took whatever title they wanted as long as they left me the one of senator. She added, don't forget to remind those who might not have been around at the time that McCarthy stood up alone in 1968 to protest what he saw as an immoral war. He galvanized young people throughout the country. They gave up their jobs and set aside their educations to work for his campaign. You saw them in the cathedral last Saturday, gray and wrinkled, but still proud of having once been a part of something decent and honorable. I have to say, however, that Senator McCarthy's warm and human side was coupled with a biting wit that was not always appreciated by its targets. After the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion in 1962, he told a reporter, well, we know the Kennedy administration is not going to make any little mistakes. On the morning after the New Hampshire primary, as he was flying back to Washington, Senator McCarthy ran into Senator Tom McIntyre, a New Hampshire Democrat who had campaigned against him. He said, "Hello, Tom. I'm surprised to see you flying first class this morning." And when Governor George Romney complained about while running for president in 1972 that he had been brainwashed by U.S. military officials in Vietnam, Senator McCarthy said, "I would have thought a light rinse would be sufficient." But he also directed his humor at himself. In 1965, he underwent prostate surgery, and there were rumors in Minnesota that he was dying. When he made his first visit to the state following his recovery, he said, "People didn't want to shake my hand, they wanted to feel my pulse." A sixth quality was Senator McCarthy's unquestioned courage. He won his first elections to the House and the Senate by taking on entrenched incumbents, and he was the first member of Congress to publicly oppose Senator Joe McCarthy of Wisconsin for conducting his communist witch hunts. Ironically, some of the votes Eugene McCarthy got in New Hampshire and Wisconsin in 1968 were said to come from people who thought they were voting for Joe McCarthy. And of course there was his 1968 challenge of Lyndon Johnson, which was the catalyst for all that happened in that turbulent year and much that has happened since. And later, after leaving public office, of course, his challenges of the two-party system, the campaign finance law, and the political process itself. Finally, there were his skills as author, political commentator, and social critic. He wrote more than 20 books filled with intelligent and insightful commentary on politics and government, and some with wonderful memories of his Minnesota boyhood and life in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, where he had a home and where he is now buried. All of them are still worth reading. I would like to conclude by quoting one of my favorite authors, myself. These are words I used to sum up Senator McCarthy's career more than 3 decades ago, and they are still relevant. The man who recognized that the Vietnam War was a great moral evil and stood up at a critical moment in American history to warn the nation of it was Eugene McCarthy. His stand against the Vietnam War was a singular act of courage that grows larger in retrospect and guarantees him a secure place in the history of his country. Eugene McCarthy showed it is possible for one man to make a difference in a democratic society, and that not even the immense power of the presidency can withstand the opposition from a public aroused by a man who speaks out against what he sees as an immoral action by a government. Whether he is destined to be remembered as the midwife of a new day in American politics, or merely as a brilliant gadfly of the old, it is clear that American politics in the future will reflect the dedication to reforming political processes and limiting executive power that is the common denominator of Eugene McCarthy's public career. Thank you.
Abbot John, Brother Dietrich, the McCarthy family, and friends, I'm honored to be in this magnificent sanctuary today, on this campus where so much of Gene McCarthy's life, remarkable life, was centered. Gene stood apart in the Senate, brilliant, witty, informed, ethical, and progressive, with, as someone put it, the most unusual mind ever known in politics. Senator Lee Metcalf, who came to the Senate about the same time as Gene, and who was a friend of his, and I were talking one day about Gene McCarthy. And I still remember Metcalf's words. He said, "Well, you know, Gene is different. He's not just any old senator like we are." Well, and he was searching for a word, and he finally said, "He's elegant." And that's exactly what Gene was. If you wanted to paint an ideal picture of what you wanted a senator to look like, and you were a genius, you would come up with something that looked like Gene McCarthy. We served in the Senate together during the high tide of progressive reform, when the great Civil Rights Acts, Medicare, Medicaid, aid to education, environmental protection, and much more were enacted. I hope history will give credit to Gene for his role in these transformational achievements. But sadly, while so much progress was being made at home, the horrible war in Vietnam was building, taking thousands of lives as it tore our nation apart. For a time, it seemed as though the war, supported as it was by both parties, would be carried on and on without end. And it might have, except for Gene McCarthy. The quiet man from Minnesota, someone wrote, the gray man with a professorial manner, in the most dramatic political upset in modern history, had beaten our nation's most experienced and formidable political operator to force an end to his presidency. Gene once wrote, I am alone in the land of aardvarks. I am walking west. All the aardvarks are going east. Being alone was not a sin to him. In fact, I think he liked it. At our political beginning, all of us, Humphrey, all of us, including Gene, shared common goals and visions of a good society. But McCarthy had a spark in him that was different. You could tell it. A spark that illuminated our nation when no other politician dared tell the truth. I was late to follow it, and it haunts me to this day that I did not listen carefully enough to Gene when he was walking west alone. With Gene's passing, Humphrey and McCarthy are now gone. Earlier we had heard from Al Isley, our nation's most respected McCarthy-Humphrey biographer. In his classic Almost to the Presidency, he writes about how together they changed Minnesota and deepened the fabric of decency and fairness in American life, and laid the groundwork for Kennedy's election to the presidency. Together, they were simply irresistible. For reasons that I will never fully understand, they became estranged at great cost to the cause of American decency, and it will always sadden me. I hope we do not think of Gene's courageous leadership as simply an interesting historical event. At the time, Gene said, and I use his words, he said he acted against the war in the hope that he could help overcome a national sense of political helplessness and restore a belief in the process of American politics and government. What Gene did in his time, his challenge to power, his call to a new generation of leadership, is as much needed now as it was then. And I hope that we will honor his memory by following his example of conscience and courage to end wrong and restore the civic renewal we need so today. I have been around public life for a long, long time, and I've seen them all. And without a doubt, Gene McCarthy was an American giant, one of our best. We will all miss him. God bless you, Gene.
After my father died, I was fielding phone calls from reporters who were working on stories about him. And one of them asked me, how did I think my father would want to be remembered? And I said, of course, he's going to be remembered for his stand against the Vietnam War. but I thought he also would want to be remembered for the congressional work he did on the social programs that Vice President Mondale mentioned. His work for labor rights, civil rights, equal rights. But I really thought he wanted to be, I told the reporter, remembered for his poetry. In fact, Dad had said the reason he ran for president was to get his poetry published. Dad said if you wanted to understand a place, it was more important to read the poets of the city or town than the newspaper. If you wanted to understand Chicago, read Sandburg and not the Tribune. So for this service, I thought I would read some of his poems, because to understand the man, you need to read his poems and his poetry. The poems appear in a collection of essays and stories and other writings about Minnesota, about his hometown, Watkins, his family, his brother, his sisters, and the land. And one thing you take away from these stories and poems is his deep affection for the land of Minnesota and the people. And the first, I'm going to read 6 poems, and the first 4 come from a series where he describes sort of the evolution of Minnesota, starting with the withdrawal of the great glaciers of the Ice Age. It's appropriately called Beginnings. Now, silent, grate and grind of glacial ice on stone, on clay, plowing beds for rivers, pushing over hills, gouging basins for lakes, a million years of waiting for the basalt land with cold winds whining over the ice case, snow saws cutting ledges and lines, and then a sound of water dripping, telegraphing the imperceptible retreat, the slow shrinking of the ice shield, the beginnings of rivers that would flow south, of rivers waiting to flow north, scant grass among the stones, straggling moss, and that most timid of trees, the tamarack. And the next poem, called Sounds, describes the return of the animals and the arrival of man. A bird's cry first, a weasel's shriek, then the guttural otter and the snow fox's bark, whispers of grass, the boom of buffalo herds, the voices of men, syllabic, naming the land in simplicity, Wabasha, Manitoba, Minnehaha, Mankato, chipping stones, hard for flint arrowheads, shaping sandstone, soft for peace pipes. And then a new sound, singing Hennepin, Frontenac, Duluth, the voyagers singing to the rhythm of their oars. The next poem, Work, describes the arrival of the first settlers in their wagons. The rattle of the oak against ox horns, the creak of wood against wood, of axle and hub of Red River wagons, and then the unmistakable sound of horses, of harnessed irons of bridles, of saddles of leathers, new English names of settlers and soldiers of commerce and trade, Ramsey, Rice, Walker, and then the many mixed voices and sounds of axes and saws and of hammers, building houses and barns, Germans and Irish, Swedes, Norwegians, and Danes. And the last poem is about the flood of immigrants who followed, who filled out and shaped this state and its people. And later Finns and Icelanders, Italians, Yugoslavs, Poles, and many others, carpenters and smiths, farmers, ministers, priests, merchants, miners, sawmill singing, the hum of the mill, the flutter of mowers, the beat of the reel of the reaper, the thump of the thresher. Summer lightning, the line storm, the drum roll of the thunder, the whistle of hail, the snow and sleet, and the hard-cutting blizzard. Gunfire in uprisings, the James boys done in Northfield. Next poem occasioned Garrison Keillor to comment what kind of politician would be able to see poetry in the names of old women from a small town in Minnesota. The poem's called Litany of Saints and Others. Matilda Uphoven, Minnie Quast, Lucinda Nistler, Verena Brixius, Anastasia Duckendorf, Lucille Huckenpiller, Mercedes Meyerhofer, Leela Kelty, Cleo Kletsky, Eva Warner, Lois Henricks, Agnes Schonecker, Miss Vossen, the piano teacher, Mary Eaton, the milliner, Sisters Ancella, Lucetta, Eucharista, St. Helen, and Edicta, Florence, Olga, Evelyn Eklund, cousins, Esther, Rita, and Rose. And the last poem I'm going to read was one of his favorites, and it's called The Death of the Old Plymouth Rock Hen. It was tragic when her time came after a lifetime of laying brown eggs among the white of leghorns. Now unattractive to the rooster, laying no more eggs, faking it on other hens' eggs and nests, caught in the act, taken to the woodpile in the winter of execution. A quick stroke of the axe, one first and last upward cast of eyes that in life had looked only down, scanning the ground for seeds and worms and for the shadow of the hawk. Now those eyes are covered by yellow lids, closing from the bottom up. Decapitated, she did not act like a chicken with its head cut off. No pirouettes, no somersaults, no last indignity. Like an English queen she died. On wings that had never known flight, she flew straight into the woodpile, and there beat out slow death while her curdled voice ran out in blood. A scalding and a plucking of no purpose, no goose feathers for a comforter, no duck's down for a pillow, no quill for a pen. In the open body, no entrail message for the horsepix, not one egg of promise in the oviduct. In the gray gizzard, no diamond or emerald, but only half-ground corn, sure evidence of unprofitability. The breast and legs, the wings and thighs, the strong heart, the Pope's nose, fit only for chicken soup and stew. And then, in March, near winter's end, when bloodied and feathered wood is used, the odor of burnt offerings above the kitchen stove. Dad was often somewhat of a mystery to people because he was a politician who quoted poetry and philosophy. I think maybe one of the secrets, or the real reason he seemed different, was he was a poet who serendipitously had wandered into public life.